was 1614. Adrian Block, a Dutch explorer, sailed through the Long Island Sound to the Connecticut River. In 1640, Elizabeth Winthrop, her husband Robert Feake, along with their friend Captain Daniel Patrick, traveled to an untamed wilderness and purchased land from the Indians in an exchange for 25 coats. In 1665, Greenwich declared itself a separate township. 27 different colonists purchased more land in and around Greenwich. Among those names was a Joseph Meade. The settlement was called Horseneck, and their land was particularly fertile. For the next 200 years, this point of land would be farmed by the Oliver Meade family. There were beautiful springs, some very close to the shore, where both cattle grazed and picnickers came from Round Hill and Stanwich to swim in the Sound near Horseneck Field Point and out to Round Island. In the early 1800s, Greenwich farmers grew and shipped major produce from Cos Cob, supplying the growing population of New York City. But by mid-century, the local landscape was beginning to change. The railroad came to town and later steamship service. Fashionable inns were springing up along the Greenwich landscape, attracting wealthy New Yorkers for the summer season. In 1886, the Belle Haven Casino provided the focal point for much of the Greenwich social scene.
The emergence of Belle Haven was a part of this, many in the city wanting to move out into the country, still having some connection to culture, to art, and to work in the city, but still be out in the country and be able to enjoy this new leisure life, which would involve anything from horse riding to yachts to any number of leisurely picnic activities. But this brings with it, of course, with Belle Haven, the emergence of this idea of the summer retreat or the summer cottages that develop all along the Gold Coast.
From 1892 to 1902, the half-mile loop around the center of the circle operated as a trotting track by the Field Point Driving Association. This once fertile farmland of this beautiful peninsula was about to become one of the most coveted pieces of real estate along the Connecticut shore. In 1899, two of the men who had developed Belle Haven, Nathaniel Witherall and Thomas Mayo, along with J. Walsh, formed the Field Point Land Company and bought 112 acres from Oliver D. Meade. Planning to leave the 22 acres of land in the center of the point open, the men created generous parcels to attract wealthy buyers so a few large houses could be built overlooking the water and keeping the privacy of an open park in the center. At the turn of the last century, Americans were experiencing the country life movement, and there was a real emphasis on landscape and park-like settings.
Parks are connected to gardens, and gardens are connected back to the working farms that had existed in these kind of rural conditions by the Meade family and others for hundreds of years earlier. Behind me I have an example in Field Point Circle of the working plots of land for the kitchen in the center of the circle. And on the perimeter we have the more romantic and picturesque landscape that relates to the water and to the activities of the water.
What separated it in some ways from its sister development, Belle Haven, right to the west, was partly the preexistence of this oval track and the fact that that really pleasing geometric shape that was there laid down as the format for the drive was retained.
In December of 1901, the Field Point Land Company sold their first lot to Frank L. Froment, who bought nearly 4 acres on the circle. Froment, a New Yorker, was an iron and steel merchant. His grand 3-story Georgian took a year to build and cost $20,000. We know this house today as Maralta. But in November 1909, the house was sold to the man who would become the founder of Connecticut Power and Light, R.A.C. Smith, known as Rack. Smith had traveled throughout Europe and had decided to hire an architect who had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris.
The École was extremely influential at the time. It was the school for American architects to study in, and it trained them in a very classical historicist kind of architecture that was not experimental in any way.
Many different historical styles were represented as period revivals. These evoked the pedigree and history of European aristocracy. The renovations were carried out by skilled stonemasons and artists from Italy. The construction took 3 years to complete.
So whether the house needed it or not, sometimes they went through complete transformation, and Muralta is one of those houses that did.
The week before Frank Froman purchased his property, Gustav Bauman bought 2 lots totaling 8 acres. His house was equipped with a saltwater swimming tank, considered quite modern for the time.
The Gustav Bauman House is an example of yet another style that appeared around the circle, which is really a more modest interpretation of an English cottage-style house, not a high-style house like the 2 incarnations of Muralta.
The house was completed in 1902. He came to New York from Switzerland and became president and principal stockholder of the Biltmore Hotel. He sold the grand house in 1905 to Albert Henry and Jesse D. Wiggin. He had been president and CEO of Chase National Bank, which also owned American Express at the time. He was a famous resident of 740 Park Avenue in New York, and of the house that became Jack and Charlie's Speakeasy, which was the precursor to the 21 Club. George Dominic purchased his land on July 2, 1902. Dominic had grown up on Putnam Hill and was an early commuter to his New York brokerage firm, Dominic and Dominic. This extraordinary house began its existence in 1902 and was designed by one of the more fashionable architectural firms at the time, Lam Rich. Construction was underway by Christmas, and the local Greenwich Graphic reported a building boom. Lam and Rich had built impressive residential and collegiate buildings on campuses at Dartmouth, Amherst, Williams, Barnard, and Smith. Now they set to work on Field Point, on the house that is still known as Easterly.
There's a great postcard view of Easterly taken from the circle toward the house that shows the kitchen gardens in the foreground. There were a series of kitchen gardens that connected to each property, and the interior of the oval was actually left undeveloped for many years after the perimeter properties were designed and built.
Harry S. Thompson, a New York contractor, purchased land on November 10, 1902. His firm, Thompson and Stabbett, built 2 houses at the end of the park, one for his son and one for a Miss Helen Thompson. The 2 dwellings were listed on the Greenwich Grand List in 1903 and valued at $70,000. Edward Shearson was born in Ontario, Canada in 1864, and at the turn of the century he was the controller of United States Steel. He bought his lot on November 13, 1902. The same year he started Shearson Hamel & Company.
The Shearson house is another example of the classical taste that still resonates with the American populace, and this is a style that also came out of that classical training of the Beaux-Arts in Paris. It's important to remember that the air conditioning that we take for granted today didn't exist, and these were country houses. People were coming here to escape the heat of the summer. Every one of these houses would have had canvas awnings that could roll out at Memorial Day and roll up again at Labor Day. The first impression some people might have of the house would be coming from the water, as a personal yacht would be docked at the private pier behind a house. Guests could walk up. They'd be seeing the house for the first time, not from the street side, but from the water side.
He had been a member of the Indian Harbor Yacht Club, the Larchmont Yacht Club, the New York Yacht Club, and many others.
The George Pynchon house is a great example of how much fun some of the owners and builders were having designing these houses. This particular house combines a Tudor style with a mansard roof, which is the very tall, pitched, four-sided roof that's more typically associated with French architecture. not to forget its great ivy covering, because the sooner these houses got covered with ivy and the landscaping grew in, the more they evoked that country life feeling that was so important to the time.
George Pynchon ran the Wall Street firm Pynchon and Company. He was a champion yacht racer on his sloop Istelina. His house in the park featured a cozy library as well as a formal dining room overlooking the Sound. George Dar was born in Clarion County, Pennsylvania in 1853. With his brothers, he engaged successfully in the coal business in that state. He came to New York City and started a brokerage business, Dar and Moore. Dar was a member of the Greenwich Country Club, the Field Club, and was an avid golfer and yachtsman. His Georgian Revival house recalls the great English country houses of that period.
The stable at the Dar House was designed with the same kind of attention to detail and architectural features as the house itself, because these outbuildings were as important to the property and the way people lived as the main houses. There was a crossover between horseback riding, carriages, stables, and the automobile and garages. Martin Quinn was the business partner of E.C. Benedict, who is well remembered for commuting to New York City from his Indian Harbor house by his private yacht. The two business partners built houses across the harbor from one another, and I'm sure it was no coincidence that this happened. Benedict's being on Indian Harbor and Martin Quinn's being on the side of Field Point Park that enabled him to look across the Sound. It's said that Quinn had the finest grove of tulip trees to be found anywhere. That underscores how important the landscaping of these properties was, and the sense that each owner was creating a small park on his or her own property and contributing to that feeling of the country retreat.
Seymour Hyde purchased his land December 1, 1902. Lone Oak was completed in 1903. He exemplified the gentleman's enjoyment of the country life in Greenwich as a yachtsman and horseman.
Seymour Hyde's Lone Oak, occupying a fabulous spot at the tip of the point, attracted in the 1940s the well-known philanthropist and department store entrepreneur W.T. Grant, who was first enthralled with both the house and the beautiful rose gardens that were there.
Hyde was a member of the New York cotton converter Albert G. Hyde and Son. He died at 54 years old at his country home in Field Point Park following a fall from his horse, which he suffered on the Field Club's bridle path. When Oliver Mead owned it, it was a wooded island. Under Mead, Round Island was a favorite picnic and swimming spot. Hoping to preserve this public usage, the town agreed to buy it plus 6 more acres for $75,000 to be used as a park. That deal was scuttled, as the powerful new summer residents in Belle Haven didn't like the idea of a public park so close to their exclusive homes.
While there were deed restrictions that each owner of property in Field Point Circle had to adhere to, everyone was free to hire their own architect, and some names were better known than others. Henry C. Pelton, who designed the lodge for the Chapman family, was also the architect of Riverside Church in New York. And it was not unusual for Greenwich homeowners to bring in New York architects to design their houses, partly because they had good reputations, they were known in their field, but also because they traveled in fashionable, sophisticated social circles.
Sam Pryor was born in Palmyra, Missouri, only days after the Civil War ended. In 1914, he became president of the Remington Arms Company. His son, Sam Pryor Jr., was later vice president of Pan American Airways and a great friend of Charles Lindbergh. When the Pryors moved east, they bought 20 acres on Field Point Park. Cross and Cross designed the house, and it most resembled an English Cotswold cottage.
I'm sitting in the great room of the Priory, a beautiful room that does justice to a beautiful house, the last of the first group built here in Field Point Park and finished in 1916. This was a classic Cotswold cottage design meant to really convey the grace of the English countryside.
The development of the land on Horseneck Field Point represents a unique period in American history. Wealthy New Yorkers, who had amassed fortunes in finance, utilities, iron and steel, sought the country life and its leisure activities to escape the city. A robust economy, the absence of a personal income tax, coupled with a surge of national optimism, led to the development of many exclusive enclaves around the country. Over the years, many of these original communities lost favor and became unfashionable. Little remains of the grandeur of the past. But Field Point Park continues to be one of the most sought-after communities with the most expensive properties. America's most notable financial citizens are drawn to the park because of its geographic convenience and dramatic waterfront vistas. Today, only 3 of the original 12 estates remain. But the homes here now rival the magnificence of the originals constructed over a century ago.